"Don't touch him," the captain of the royal guard warned in a voice barely above a whisper. "If the Alpha King loses control, no one in this kingdom can stop what happens next." Emily Carter tightened her grip on the worn leather strap of her healer's satchel and looked past the armored soldiers lining the endless marble corridor. She had traveled nearly 200 miles from her quiet mountain village to answer a royal summons that no healer had ever dared refuse. The towering halls of Night Haven Palace felt colder than the crisp autumn air outside, their polished stone walls reflecting the flickering glow of iron chandeliers that seemed far too small for ceilings stretching almost 60 feet overhead. Every servant she passed lowered their eyes. Every guard stood perfectly still. Even the echoes of her footsteps sounded hesitant, as if the palace itself understood the burden carried within its walls. Emily had treated fevers, broken bones, exhausted farmers, frightened children, and aging veterans, but she had never treated a king. More importantly, she had never met an Alpha King whose name alone could silence an entire room. Damian Blackwood ruled one of the oldest werewolf kingdoms in the world, a leader respected not because he demanded fear, but because he rarely raised his voice. Stories described him as calm, disciplined, and impossible to provoke. Others claimed he had not smiled in years. Still, rumors traveled faster than truth. Some whispered that something unseen had begun changing him during recent months. Royal physicians had found nothing. Ancient scholars found no curse. Priests found no answer. Yet every sunrise seemed to leave the king more distant than the day before. Emily reminded herself that fear never healed anyone. She had promised her late grandmother long ago that every patient deserved the same compassion regardless of title, wealth, or reputation. As the heavy oak doors slowly opened, warm firelight spilled across the polished floor, revealing a vast private chamber overlooking endless forests disappearing into silver morning mist. Standing near the enormous window was a man whose presence seemed quieter than the room itself. Damian Blackwood wore simple black royal clothing embroidered with silver thread instead of ceremonial armor or jeweled robes. His broad shoulders remained perfectly straight, his posture effortless, yet his expression carried the weight of someone who had spent years protecting everyone except himself. His silver-gray eyes shifted toward the doorway the moment Emily entered, calm but watchful, as though measuring every heartbeat in the room. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence lingered, not awkward but strangely expectant. Emily offered a respectful nod instead of an elaborate bow. "Your Majesty," she said gently. "I'm Emily Carter." Damian answered with the smallest inclination of his head. "I've heard you're the healer who never refuses a patient." "Illness doesn't care about titles," she replied with a faint smile. "Neither do I." For the first time that morning, something almost resembling curiosity softened the king's expression. Nearby attendants exchanged uneasy glances. No one usually addressed the Alpha King with such simple honesty. Emily opened her satchel and removed a small notebook along with a polished silver instrument used for checking pulse and breathing. "May I examine your wrist?" she asked. The question seemed ordinary, yet the chamber somehow felt smaller as she stepped closer. Damian hesitated for only a heartbeat before extending his hand. His fingers remained steady, though his eyes never left hers. Emily reached forward with practiced confidence, placing 2 fingertips lightly against the inside of his wrist. The instant their skin met, the quiet air inside the chamber shifted. Every candle flame trembled without a breeze. The crystal glasses resting upon a nearby table produced a faint ringing sound. Outside the towering windows, a flock of white birds suddenly burst into the sky above the palace gardens. Emily instinctively looked around, confused by the strange sensation that passed through the room like invisible thunder. Damian's breathing stopped for the briefest moment. Deep within the silence he had spent years mastering, something ancient stirred awake. A voice older than memory echoed through the hidden corners of his soul with absolute certainty. "Mine." Damian's hand withdrew almost instantly, not from anger, but from shock so profound that even he could barely understand it. Emily blinked, surprised by the sudden movement. "Did I hurt you?" she asked softly. Damian stared at the place where her fingertips had rested, then slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers once more. For the first time in his entire reign, the Alpha King found himself fearing not an enemy beyond his kingdom's walls, but the impossible truth awakened by the touch of one ordinary healer. Emily remained still, allowing the silence to settle before speaking again. She had learned long ago that frightened patients often needed calm more than questions, and although nothing about Damien Blackwood suggested fear, she recognized the look of someone trying to understand something that defied reason. She lowered her hand and offered a reassuring smile that carried neither judgment nor curiosity. "If you are uncomfortable, Your Majesty, we can continue at your pace," she said gently. Damien looked toward the towering windows overlooking the palace gardens, where morning sunlight slowly dissolved the silver mist blanketing the ancient forest. His breathing had already returned to its familiar rhythm, but beneath that outward control, an invisible tension refused to disappear. The strange voice that had echoed through his thoughts only moments earlier had vanished, leaving behind an unsettling certainty he could neither explain nor dismiss. He had spent decades mastering every instinct inherited from generations of alpha rulers. Discipline had become second nature, stronger than anger, stronger than pride, stronger even than fear. Yet one simple touch from a healer he had never met had shaken a foundation he believed could never crack. "Please continue," he finally answered, his voice calm enough that only he noticed the effort required to keep it steady. Emily nodded without hesitation. She reached for her notebook and quietly recorded several observations before asking ordinary medical questions about his sleep, appetite, headaches, and recent fatigue. Damien answered each one honestly, surprised by how normal the conversation felt despite everything happening beneath the surface. Emily never treated him like a legendary alpha king. She spoke to him exactly as she would have spoken to an exhausted farmer or an overworked blacksmith from her village. Somehow that simple kindness made maintaining his composure even more difficult. She stepped closer once more to examine the color of his eyes in the natural light streaming through the windows. "May I?" she asked, lifting a small silver examination light. Damien gave a slight nod. As she leaned forward, her attention remained completely focused on her work. She noticed faint shadows beneath his eyes that suggested many restless nights, but his pulse had already returned to a perfectly steady rhythm. "You have remarkable self-control," she observed thoughtfully. "Most people under prolonged exhaustion cannot steady their heartbeat this quickly." Damien allowed himself the smallest smile. "Perhaps I have had more practice than most." Emily smiled in return, unaware of how much that expression alone unsettled him. The warmth in her eyes carried no ambition, no calculation, and no fear. She simply wanted to help. Outside the chamber, two palace guards exchanged uncertain glances through the partially open doorway. They had guarded the Alpha King for years and knew every subtle habit he possessed. One quietly whispered, "Have you ever seen His Majesty allow anyone to stand that close for so long?" The older guard slowly shook his head. "Never." Inside the room, Emily carefully checked his breathing again before stepping back to organize her notes. "I cannot identify any ordinary illness," she admitted. "Your physical condition is excellent. Whatever is troubling you does not appear to come from injury, infection, or exhaustion alone." Damien folded his hands behind his back, grateful for the extra distance between them, although part of him immediately regretted creating it. The strange contradiction only deepened his confusion. His instincts urged him to remain near her, while every lesson of discipline demanded the opposite. He had never experienced opposing desires with such equal strength. Emily noticed the thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Sometimes," she said softly, "our minds carry burdens our bodies cannot explain. Even the strongest people deserve rest." The words lingered in the quiet chamber long after she spoke them. No advisor, scholar, or physician had ever addressed him with such simple compassion. They had offered solutions, strategies, rituals, and theories, but none had reminded him that strength and weariness could exist together. Damien looked at her as though seeing something entirely unfamiliar. Not power, not admiration, not obedience. Humanity. Before either of them could continue, a respectful knock interrupted the silence. The captain of the royal guard stepped inside and bowed. "Your Majesty, the royal council has assembled. They await your presence." Damien did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on Emily, who had already returned to organizing the small instruments inside her satchel, completely unaware that every passing minute in her company made it harder for the Alpha King to remember why distance had once seemed so effortless. Damien remained silent long after the captain finished speaking, the weight of duty pulling him toward the council chamber, while an unfamiliar instinct urged him to stay exactly where he was. The members of the Royal Council had gathered countless times over the years, discussing trade routes, harvest forecasts, border treaties, and the endless responsibilities that came with protecting an entire kingdom. Normally, he would have walked into that chamber without hesitation, prepared to make difficult decisions with calm precision. Today, however, his attention lingered on something far less predictable. Emily closed her notebook and carefully arranged her medical instruments inside the leather satchel that had traveled with her across nearly 200 miles of winding mountain roads. She looked completely unaware that the room itself felt different whenever she occupied it. "Your Majesty," the captain repeated respectfully. "The council has been waiting for nearly 15 minutes. Damien finally shifted his gaze toward the officer. "Tell them I will arrive shortly." The captain hesitated for only a fraction of a second before bowing again. "Yes, Your Majesty." As the heavy doors closed behind him, the chamber returned to quiet stillness. Emily looked toward Damien with gentle concern. "I do not wish to interfere with your responsibilities," she said. "If your advisors are waiting, we can continue the examination later." Damien considered her words carefully. Under ordinary circumstances, he would have agreed immediately. Instead, he found himself asking a question that surprised even him. "How long were you planning to remain at the palace?" Emily smiled politely. "Only until I complete my evaluation. If I cannot identify the cause today, I may need another examination tomorrow morning." Sometimes answers reveal themselves after observing a patient over time. Damien gave a thoughtful nod, relieved by an emotion he could not explain. The idea that she would remain inside the palace another day brought an unexpected sense of calm that felt entirely unreasonable. Emily noticed the subtle change in his expression. "You seem more relaxed than when I arrived," she observed. Perhaps speaking openly has already helped. Damien almost laughed at the irony. If she knew what had truly changed inside him, she would likely reach an entirely different conclusion. Before he could answer, another knock echoed softly through the chamber. This time a young palace attendant entered carrying a silver tray with fresh tea and warm bread. She carefully placed everything upon a polished oak table before lowering her eyes respectfully. "The royal kitchen prepared refreshments for the healer," she explained quietly. Emily looked genuinely surprised. "That is very thoughtful." After the attendant departed, Emily poured a cup of tea and thanked the kitchen staff despite their absence. The simple gesture caught Damien's attention. Most visitors accepted royal hospitality as though it were expected. Emily treated every kindness as though it deserved gratitude. She broke a small piece of bread before setting another plate across the table toward Damien. "You should eat something," she said naturally. Even kings cannot think clearly on an empty stomach. Damien looked at the offered plate for a long moment before accepting it with a faint smile. "I cannot remember the last person who gave me instructions instead of requests." Emily laughed softly, the sound filling the enormous chamber with unexpected warmth. Healers become rather stubborn when health is involved. For reasons he could not explain, Damien found himself smiling more openly than he had in years. Outside the chamber, several palace servants quietly paused in the corridor after noticing the unusual expression on their king's face through the partially opened doorway. One whispered, "Did His Majesty just smile?" Another servant blinked in disbelief. "I have served this palace for 8 years. I have never seen that before." The whispers spread gently through nearby halls, carried not by scandal but by astonishment. Inside, Emily unfolded a map of the kingdom she had brought from her village. "If your symptoms began recently," she said thoughtfully, "perhaps something changed in your routine. New responsibilities, different travel, a place you visited. Even small changes can matter." Damien studied the map beside her, standing close enough to notice the faint scent of lavender carried by the dried herbs tucked inside her satchel. The strange presence within him stirred once again, quieter this time, but no less certain. It did not command. It simply recognized. Somewhere deep beneath years of perfect discipline, the ancient bond continued, awakening one quiet heartbeat at a time. Damien slowly stepped back before the feeling could deepen further, But he already understood one truth that no physician, scholar, or advisor could explain. Whatever mystery had entered his life that morning had not arrived with illness. It had walked through the palace gates carrying a weathered leather satchel, speaking with gentle honesty, completely unaware that the future of an Alpha King had begun changing the moment she reached for his hand. The royal council meeting finally ended nearly 2 hours later, yet Damien could recall almost nothing that had been discussed. Trade agreements had been approved, harvest reports had been reviewed, and border patrol schedules had been adjusted, but every decision had felt strangely distant, as though part of his attention had remained somewhere else inside the palace. As soon as the final advisor left the council chamber, Damien declined the attendants who offered to escort him to lunch and instead chose a quieter route through the eastern corridors overlooking the royal gardens. Sunlight poured through tall stained glass windows, painting ribbons of blue, amber, and crimson across polished marble floors. Normally, he appreciated the peaceful silence of these halls because they allowed him a rare moment to think. Today, his thoughts refused to settle. The strange certainty awakened earlier had not faded with time. Instead, it had become calmer, almost patient, quietly existing beneath every breath without demanding anything from him. He reached the palace garden expecting solitude, but paused when he noticed Emily kneeling beside a stone fountain surrounded by blooming white lilies. An elderly palace gardener stood nearby holding his wrist with an embarrassed smile, while Emily gently wrapped a clean linen bandage around a small scrape caused by pruning rose bushes. "You should allow someone else to lift the heavier baskets for a few days," she said kindly. "The flowers will still be here after your hand has healed." The old gardener chuckled. "These roses have been my responsibility for 30 years. They might miss me." Emily laughed softly as she secured the bandage. "Then let them miss you for one afternoon instead of several weeks." Damien remained unnoticed beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree, watching the exchange without intending to interrupt. There was no ceremony in the way Emily spoke. She did not care whether someone wore royal silk or gardening gloves. Everyone received the same patient attention, the same respectful smile, the same quiet encouragement. After thanking her several times, the gardener carefully returned to his work with renewed confidence. Before leaving the fountain, Emily noticed a small bird struggling near the edge of the stone basin after becoming tangled in a trailing vine. She crouched immediately, gently freeing the frightened creature before opening her hands. For a heartbeat, the tiny bird remained perched upon her fingers, then spread its wings and disappeared into the bright afternoon sky. Emily watched it fly away with genuine happiness, completely unaware that someone else had witnessed every moment. Damien slowly stepped forward, his footsteps finally drawing her attention. She stood and smiled naturally. "Your Majesty, I hope the council meeting went well." Damien looked toward the bird disappearing above the palace towers before answering. "It was productive." Emily nodded. "That is good to hear." Neither mentioned the fact that he had clearly been watching her. Instead, they began walking slowly along the winding stone pathway bordered by lavender and climbing roses. The gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers across the gardens, while fountains echoed softly in the distance. "Do you always stop to help everyone?" Damien asked after several quiet moments. Emily looked thoughtful. "Not because I believe I can solve every problem," she replied. "Sometimes people simply need to know that someone noticed." Damien considered those words carefully. Throughout his reign, he had protected thousands of people through laws, diplomacy, and difficult decisions. Yet he suddenly wondered how often he had truly noticed the small struggles happening directly beside him. Emily paused beside a flowering cherry tree whose pale blossoms drifted lazily through the afternoon light. "When I was little," she said, "my grandmother used to tell me that kindness rarely changes the whole world in a single day. It changes one person's day, and sometimes that is enough to begin changing everything else." Damien looked at her quietly. The simplicity of her belief felt stronger than many speeches he had heard inside the throne room. She did not seek recognition for her compassion because she never considered it extraordinary. It was simply the way she chose to live. As they continued walking, several palace servants paused respectfully along the pathway, surprised to see their reserved king strolling through the gardens without urgency, listening more than speaking. None dared interrupt, yet every curious glance carried the same silent question. What had changed? Damien himself could not answer. He only knew that the restless tension within him eased each time Emily smiled, each time she spoke with gentle honesty, each time she treated another stranger with effortless kindness. For the first time in many years, the vast palace no longer felt quite as empty, and although he still could not explain the impossible bond quietly awakening inside him, he began to understand that whatever destiny had placed before him was revealing itself not through power or ancient prophecy, but through the ordinary compassion of a healer who never realized how extraordinary she truly was. Late that afternoon, the palace settled into the quiet rhythm that followed a busy day of council meetings and royal duties. Warm sunlight stretched across the marble corridors, slowly giving way to the softer glow of evening lanterns as servants prepared the castle for another night. Emily had been offered a comfortable guest room overlooking the eastern gardens, but she found herself unable to remain indoors for long. She preferred fresh air to decorated walls, and after leaving her satchel neatly beside the room's writing desk, she wandered toward the vast royal library in search of medical texts that might help explain Damien's mysterious condition. The library occupied nearly an entire wing of the palace, its towering shelves reaching almost 40 feet toward painted ceilings filled with constellations and ancient legends. Dust drifted lazily through golden beams of light pouring from tall windows, while countless leather-bound volumes rested in perfect order. Emily moved quietly between the shelves, fascinated by collections that far exceeded anything she had ever seen in her mountain village. As she searched for old records describing unusual alpha conditions, a warm voice interrupted her thoughts. "You must be the healer everyone has been talking about." Emily turned to see a young nobleman carrying several books beneath one arm. He appeared close to Damien's age, dressed in refined navy blue court clothing instead of formal royal attire. His friendly smile carried genuine curiosity rather than arrogance. "I am Nathan Reed," he said politely, "royal historian and advisor on ancient traditions." Emily returned the smile. "Emily Carter. It is nice to meet you." Nathan carefully placed his books upon a nearby table before pulling one particularly worn volume from the shelf. "If you are researching unusual conditions affecting alpha rulers, this collection contains accounts written over 300 years ago. Most physicians forget these records exist." Emily accepted the heavy book with sincere gratitude. "Thank you. This may be exactly what I need." Nathan laughed softly. "The library rarely receives visitors who appreciate old books as much as I do. It is refreshing." They sat across from one another at a long oak reading table, quietly comparing historical notes while discussing herbal remedies, forgotten traditions, and stories preserved by earlier generations. Their conversation flowed naturally because both valued knowledge more than status. Emily listened with genuine interest while Nathan explained the kingdom's history, and in return she described the healing practices taught by her grandmother in the mountains. Neither noticed the quiet footsteps approaching from the far end of the library. Damien had come searching for one particular document before tomorrow's council session, yet the moment he entered the enormous hall, his attention was drawn elsewhere. Across the room, Emily laughed gently at something Nathan had said, her bright expression carrying the same effortless warmth Damien had witnessed in the gardens. Nathan leaned forward to point toward an illustration inside the ancient manuscript, and Emily thanked him with another grateful smile. Nothing about the interaction was improper. It was simply two kind people sharing knowledge. Yet deep inside Damien, the calm presence that had quietly rested throughout the afternoon shifted once again. The ancient instinct awakened by Emily's first touch did not speak with anger or demand. Instead, it filled him with an unfamiliar ache, one he had never experienced despite years spent among nobles, diplomats, and neighboring rulers. He remained perfectly still behind a distant bookshelf, reminding himself that Emily owed him nothing beyond the courtesy she showed every person she met. She was free to speak with whomever she wished. She had every right to smile without his permission. Even so, watching another man earn that smile stirred emotions Damien had no language to describe. He quietly stepped back before either of them noticed his presence, choosing restraint over impulse just as he had countless times before. Outside the library windows, the evening sky deepened into shades of amber and blue while the first stars slowly appeared above the palace towers. Emily finally closed the ancient volume with satisfaction. "These records have given me several new ideas," she said happily. Nathan stood and offered a respectful nod. "If you need additional references tomorrow, I will gladly help." "I would appreciate that very much," Emily replied. As they walked toward the library entranced together, neither realized that unseen eyes had already witnessed their conversation, and somewhere within the silent halls of Night Haven Palace, Damian Blackwood accepted a truth he could no longer deny. The greatest challenge he had ever faced would not come from rival kingdoms, ancient mysteries, or the burdens of the crown. It would come from learning whether a heart that had belonged only to duty for so many years could survive the quiet fear of losing someone it had only just begun to cherish. The following morning arrived with clear skies and cool mountain air drifting through the open palace windows. Golden sunlight spilled across the stone floors of Night Haven Palace, bringing with it a sense of quiet renewal that contrasted sharply with Damian's restless night. Sleep had come only in brief moments, interrupted not by fear or troubling dreams, but by the same unanswered question that had followed him since Emily first touched his hand. He had spent years believing absolute discipline could silence every instinct. Now he understood that some truths did not disappear simply because they were ignored. After finishing his morning responsibilities before sunrise, Damian walked alone through the palace corridors until he reached the eastern balcony overlooking the royal gardens. Below, gardeners had already begun tending flower beds while servants prepared fountains for another busy day. His eyes instinctively searched the landscape until they found the familiar figure carrying a weathered leather satchel among the garden paths. Emily had risen early as always. Before returning to continue his examination, she had volunteered to help the palace herbal keeper organize fresh medicinal plants gathered before dawn. She listened carefully as the elderly caretaker explained which herbs flourished best beneath the castle walls and which required the cooler shade of the surrounding forest. Every few moments, she paused to admire a blossom or ask another thoughtful question, approaching every task with the same quiet enthusiasm she brought to healing. Damian remained on the balcony for several minutes, watching unnoticed as a feeling unlike anything he had known settled gently within him. It was no longer confusion alone. It was admiration growing steadily through countless small moments that Emily herself probably considered ordinary. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Your Majesty," Nathan Reed said respectfully after approaching from the opposite side of the balcony. The healer asked whether she might continue reviewing the historical records after today's examination. "I told her the library would always be available." Damian turned toward the historian and offered a calm nod. "You were kind to assist her." Nathan smiled warmly. "She reminds me that knowledge serves people best when it is shared." We spoke for hours yesterday without realizing how quickly time had passed. Damian listened quietly, surprised to discover that the uncomfortable feeling from the previous evening had changed. The uneasiness remained, but it was no longer directed toward Nathan. Instead, it forced him to confront something about himself. Emily inspired trust wherever she went because she offered trust first. She treated strangers as neighbors before they earned the title. She would continue forming friendships throughout the palace because kindness naturally attracted kind people. That was not something to fear. It was something to respect. A few minutes later, Emily appeared at the entrance to the balcony, carrying a small notebook filled with fresh observations. "Good morning," she said with an easy smile. "I hope both of you managed to get some rest." Nathan laughed softly. "I slept well. His Majesty probably had far more responsibilities than I did." Damian returned the faintest smile. "Perhaps." Emily stepped closer, opening her notebook. "I reviewed several historical records last night. None offered a complete answer, but they all agreed on one thing." Damian raised an eyebrow with quiet curiosity. "What did they agree on?" Emily looked directly into his eyes with calm sincerity. "Whatever is happening cannot be understood by studying the body alone. Sometimes healing begins only after someone stops hiding what they truly carry inside." The words settled between them with remarkable stillness. Nathan politely excused himself, sensing the conversation had become personal, leaving the balcony to the morning breeze and the distant sound of singing birds. Damian remained silent for several heartbeats before finally speaking with complete honesty. "There is something I have never admitted to anyone," he said quietly. Emily waited without interrupting. Ever since the moment you arrived, nothing inside my life has felt the same. Instead of stepping back or appearing frightened, Emily simply met his gaze with gentle understanding. She did not rush to explain what neither of them yet understood. She only offered the quiet patience that had always guided her heart. And as the morning sun rose higher above the kingdom, Damien realized that for the first time in many years, speaking the truth felt less frightening than continuing to hide it. The remainder of the morning passed with a quiet sense of anticipation that neither Damien nor Emily attempted to explain. After their conversation on the eastern balcony, they walked together through the palace gardens toward a secluded pavilion where the royal physicians often met to discuss unusual cases. The stone pathway curved beneath ancient oak trees whose leaves danced gently in the breeze, while colorful flowers filled the air with the scent of lavender and jasmine. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt uncertain. Instead, it carried the comfort of two people beginning to trust one another without needing constant conversation. Emily was the first to break the quiet. "Thank you for being honest with me," she said softly. Many people are afraid to admit when something in their lives changes beyond their understanding. Damien looked ahead at the sparkling fountain in the center of the garden. "I have spent most of my life believing every problem could be solved through discipline," he replied. "When something cannot be controlled, it becomes difficult to know where to begin." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes understanding comes before solutions. We cannot heal what we refuse to acknowledge." Her words settled gently in Damien's mind. They reminded him of something he had forgotten through years of leadership. A king often believed he needed every answer immediately, yet Emily approached uncertainty without fear. She accepted unanswered questions as part of the journey instead of signs of failure. When they reached the pavilion, Nathan Reed was already waiting with several carefully preserved manuscripts resting upon a polished wooden table. He greeted both of them warmly before opening one of the oldest volumes. "I found another collection written by the kingdom's earliest historians," he explained. "Most of it describes ancient Alpha traditions, but one chapter discusses unusual bonds that could not be explained by ordinary customs." Emily leaned forward with quiet curiosity, while Damien remained standing beside the open windows overlooking the gardens. Nathan carefully turned several delicate pages before stopping at an illustration showing an alpha ruler standing beside a healer beneath the rising sun. The faded writing beneath the image had become difficult to read with age, yet several lines remained remarkably clear. Emily slowly read the passage aloud. "The strongest bond is never created through command. It appears when two hearts freely choose honesty over fear. The alpha gains peace, and the one beside him becomes the place where his spirit finds rest." The pavilion fell silent. None of them spoke for several seconds. Nathan closed the ancient book carefully. "Whether these stories describe history or symbolism, I cannot say," he admitted. Emily looked toward Damien, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. Perhaps the old writers understood something that modern scholars forgot. Damien met her eyes, feeling the quiet certainty within him become stronger than it had been before. It still did not demand anything. It simply recognized that every moment spent beside Emily brought a calm no meditation, battle, or victory had ever provided. Before anyone could continue, the captain of the royal guard approached the pavilion with measured steps and offered a respectful bow. "Your Majesty, several neighboring rulers have arrived earlier than expected for tomorrow's diplomatic gathering. Preparations have already begun throughout the palace." Damien acknowledged the report with a nod. As the captain departed, Emily glanced toward the castle where servants hurried across balconies carrying flowers, banners, and elegant decorations. "It seems the palace will become much busier," she observed with a gentle smile. Damien looked from the bustling courtyard back to Emily. "Then I hope you will remain here a little longer." Emily's smile softened, carrying the same quiet kindness that had first welcomed him instead of fearing him. "If you still believe I can help," she answered, "I would be honored to stay." For the first time since the impossible change had begun, Damien no longer questioned whether he should keep his distance. He simply accepted that every new sunrise seemed brighter when Emily Carter was there to greet it. And somewhere deep within the silent strength he had guarded for so many years, an ancient loneliness finally began to disappear. By the following evening, Nighthaven Palace shimmered beneath thousands of glowing lanterns as noble families, ambassadors, and visiting rulers gathered for the annual diplomatic celebration. Elegant music drifted through the grand halls while crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across polished marble floors. Servants moved gracefully between guests carrying silver trays filled with fresh fruit, warm bread, and fragrant tea. Although the celebration honored alliances between kingdoms, Damien found his attention wandering far from politics. Standing beside the great staircase, dressed in his refined black royal attire, he welcomed each distinguished visitor with practiced composure. Every greeting was courteous, every conversation measured, yet his eyes repeatedly searched the growing crowd. At last he saw Emily entering the ballroom wearing the same modest healer's dress she had worn since arriving at the palace, accompanied only by a simple silver hairpin offered earlier that afternoon by one of the elderly palace seamstresses. She had accepted the small gift with sincere gratitude, insisting that elegance came from kindness rather than expensive clothing. Even surrounded by jeweled gowns and elaborate ceremonial robes, Emily appeared completely comfortable simply being herself. Several guests noticed her almost immediately. Some recognized the healer whose arrival had become the quiet subject of palace conversations, while others simply admired the calm confidence she carried without seeking attention. Nathan Reed approached her first with his usual friendly smile and introduced her to several scholars visiting from neighboring kingdoms. Emily listened attentively as they discussed herbal traditions, mountain plants, and forgotten healing methods, asking thoughtful questions that quickly transformed formal introductions into genuine conversations. Watching from across the ballroom, Damien realized that wherever Emily stood, the atmosphere subtly changed. People who had arrived with cautious formality found themselves smiling more easily after only a few minutes in her company. She possessed no royal title and claimed no special importance, yet her kindness quietly dissolved barriers that years of diplomacy sometimes could not. An elderly ambassador from the Northern Territories accidentally dropped a carved walking cane while moving through the crowd. Before nearby attendants could react, Emily stepped forward, carefully retrieved it, and returned it with both hands and a warm smile. The grateful ambassador thanked her with visible appreciation, and several nobles exchanged surprised glances. Small gestures often revealed character more clearly than grand speeches. Damien watched the scene with quiet admiration. He finally understood why the palace staff had begun speaking of Emily with such affection. She never acted differently depending upon who stood before her. Moments later, the musicians began performing a slower melody as guests drifted toward the palace terrace overlooking the moonlit gardens. Damien found Emily standing near the carved stone railing, gazing across the silver forest stretching beyond the kingdom. The cool evening breeze carried the fragrance of blooming jasmine through the peaceful night. He joined her without ceremony, allowing several quiet moments to pass before speaking. "You have made many friends in a very short time," he said with a gentle smile. Emily laughed softly. "I simply enjoy meeting people. Everyone has a story worth hearing." Damien looked toward the distant mountains glowing beneath the full moon. "For many years I believed strength meant carrying every burden alone." Emily turned toward him with the same patient expression that had become so familiar. "Perhaps real strength also means allowing someone to walk beside you." Damien breathed slowly, feeling the truth of those words settle deep within his heart. "If that is true," he admitted quietly, "then I have been learning strength all over again since the day you arrived." Emily's eyes softened, not with surprise, but with understanding. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped beside him at the terrace railing, both of them looking toward the peaceful kingdom sleeping beneath the stars. In that quiet shared silence, no ancient prophecy demanded an answer and no royal tradition forced a decision. There was only trust growing naturally between two people who had chosen honesty over fear, and for Damien, that simple truth felt more powerful than anything the crown had ever given him. The first light of dawn painted the towers of Nighthaven Palace in shades of gold and soft blue, washing away the last traces of night as the kingdom slowly awakened below. Gentle bells echoed from distant villages. Merchants began arranging their market stalls, and birds circled above the castle walls as though welcoming the beginning of something entirely new. Emily stood on the highest terrace overlooking the endless forests that surrounded the kingdom, her leather satchel resting quietly beside her. She had come to watch the sunrise one final time before deciding whether it was time to return to her mountain village. The peaceful silence was interrupted only by the familiar sound of measured footsteps approaching behind her. Damien walked onto the terrace wearing a simple black royal coat instead of formal ceremonial clothing, choosing to greet the morning not as a ruler addressing his court, but as a man speaking honestly to someone who had changed his life. He stopped beside her, allowing them both to admire the sunrise before saying a single word. "When you first arrived," he began quietly, "I believed you had come to heal something that was broken inside me. I understand now that you did something far greater." Emily turned toward him with her usual gentle smile. "What did I change?" Damien looked across the kingdom he had protected for so many years. "You reminded me that strength is not measured by how much a person can carry alone. It is measured by the courage to trust someone enough to walk beside them." Emily listened without interrupting, giving his words the same patient respect she had shown every conversation since arriving at the palace. Damien continued with complete sincerity. "There are ancient traditions that would tell me to decide your future for you. I refuse to do that. Whatever bond exists between us, whatever destiny others may believe in, I will never allow it to take away your freedom. If you choose to return to your village today, I will be grateful that our paths crossed. If you choose to remain here, it will only be because your heart wishes it." Emily felt the morning breeze move gently through her hair as she considered everything that had happened since stepping through the palace gates. She remembered the frightened servants, the quiet gardens, the elderly gardener, the library filled with forgotten history, the conversations beneath ancient trees, and the lonely king who had gradually revealed the kind and humble man hidden beneath the weight of the crown. She realized that none of those moments had been built upon obligation. Every step forward had been a choice. With a peaceful smile, she reached out and gently took Damien's hand. "I am not staying because of an ancient story," she said softly. "I am staying because I have seen your heart, and I believe the kingdom deserves the man you truly are." Damien looked at their joined hands before meeting her eyes once more. For the first time in many years, the quiet presence within him settled into complete peace. There was no struggle, no fear, and no uncertainty remaining. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with gratitude. Together they turned toward the sunrise as the first rays of light reached across the kingdom, promising a future built not upon power, but upon kindness, trust, and the freedom to choose one another every single day. Far below, the people of Night Haven began another ordinary morning, unaware that their greatest victory had not been won through strength or authority, but through compassion quietly changing two lives forever. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel so you will not miss more journeys of courage, destiny, and hope. Leave a like if you believe true strength is shown through kindness instead of fear. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that genuine love always begins with respect and choice. Finally, tell us in the comments, if you were Emily, would you have stayed in the kingdom or returned to the quiet life in the mountains?